Hello everyone, I'm Andrea from Andrea Flipping Unique. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, thanks for joining. So if you follow me over on my Instagram, you know that I've been pretty busy the last couple of weeks doing custom work, and this server was one of them. I had done some work back in 2023 for this couple, and they reached out to me and asked if I would redo this for them, and I couldn't say no. They always give me creative freedom when working on their pieces, so I was so excited to dive into this one. Overall, it was in really good condition. There were just a few cosmetic things that I knew I wanted to change, and this base was one of them. The paint job was also failing, but I was super excited to see what was underneath. So continue watching to see how this transformation turns out. This piece wasn't filthy by any means, but I still wiped it down with some simple green. I wasn't sure if I was going to be using my sander right off, but I wanted to be on the safe side just in case I was, and I didn't want any dirt or grime gunking up on my sander and causing potential swirl marks. I then removed all of the handles and the hinges off of the doors. A lot of these handles were broken and they were all covered in paint, so I was very fortunate that my clients wanted to upgrade them. Trigger warning. What I'm about to do is probably going to make a few of you upset, but that's a chance I'm willing to take. I was not a fan of this trim and it had to go. But before you get mad at me, here's my reasoning why. In case you missed it in the beginning, this server actually had some really awesome scallop details at the top, and I felt like my eyes were competing between the scallops and the trim on the doors and the drawers. So by removing all of that trim detail, I felt like it was really going to make that scallop design pop. I was also very excited that this trim was only held on by some brad nails and they were easy to come out. I was also even more excited to catch a glimpse as to what was actually underneath this paint. After all the trim was removed, I then grabbed my carbide scraper to start removing all of this paint, and that is when I revealed this beautiful veneer that was underneath. I was so excited, but I was also so annoyed at the same time. I really wasn't expecting too much underneath this paint, so I had it in my mind that I was actually going to be painting this whole entire piece, but that obviously quickly changed. So lesson to myself to follow my own rules, and that is to not make design choices until after I figure out what is underneath the finish. After both sides of the doors were scraped, I then went and moved to the drawers and discovered that same beautiful veneer that was underneath the paint. When removing finish on the ends of drawers like this, I like to take my scraper and use a diagonal motion to get all of that off. If I were to take my scraper and drag it down against the grain to get that finish off, I would have the chance of tearing and ripping that veneer right off the drawer. And of course, if you're not comfortable doing this, you can always hand sand this finish off, or you can go ahead and use stripper as well. And after the drawers were scraped, I then went and moved to the top where, you guessed it, was more of that beautiful veneer. After I got the majority of the finish off, I went in with my orbital sander and 120 grit sandpaper. I also lowered my speed setting to a 3 out of 5 so that I had less of a chance of burning through the veneer. I do suggest, if you're just starting out, or even if you've been doing this for a while and you don't have one, to get a sander that does have speed settings on it, because it comes in super handy when you're working with delicate veneer. I was going to be staining most of this veneer, so after I finished with 120 grit sandpaper, I moved to 150 and then did a final pass with 180. After all of that sanding was done, I moved on to the rest of the server. I started out by using my detailed carbide scraper to get into all of these little nooks and crannies. This is another tool that I highly recommend getting, whether you're a beginner or you've been doing this for 20 years. It comes with 6 blades, and each blade is dual-sided, and you can sharpen them just like a regular carbide blade. After removing as much paint as I could, I did go back in and hand sand with 120 grit sandpaper just to make sure that all of that finish was off. I used my orbital sander and 120 grit sandpaper to remove all of the paint on the rest of the server cabinet. I knew immediately when I first saw this piece that I wanted to add long handles to the doors. So in order to do that, I had to fill in the old hardware holes, and I used Quickwood epoxy putty to do that. 2 important things about this product is 1, you want to make sure that you slice it so that you get equal parts of the resin and the hardener, and 2, you want to make sure you mix it thoroughly so that it becomes one uniform color. Doing both of these things will ensure that it properly cures. A good trick when using this to fill in hardware holes is to roll it into a snake form first. That way you can make sure that it gets down into the bottom of the hole. I also make sure that I fill it a little bit higher than the hole itself. That way when I sand it off, I sand it completely flush. I also used it to fill in all of the tiny holes that were left behind from the brad nails when I took the trim off. It says on the package that it takes about 20 minutes to cure, but I always let mine sit overnight, so it's usually the last thing I do for the day. After it has completely dried, I'll either go in with my orbital sander, or sometimes I will hand sand it and just make sure that it's completely flush against the veneer. After all of that was done, it was time to tackle this base. After I loosened up the screws, I realized that it was still stuck to the bottom, and I thought maybe I missed a screw or maybe it was glued down. Upon further investigation, I realized that it was neither, and it was actually nailed in just like the trim was. So I used my painter's tool and a hammer to pry it off. I was also fortunate enough that this base had some really good supports on it, so I didn't have to add any extra wood. I then traced out some legs with a template that I had used on a previous base and then cut those out on my bandsaw. If you want to learn how to build this base for yourself, I'll have a video linked at the end that has a full tutorial. After my legs were cut out, I then measured for all of my skirts and cut those out with my miter saw. I added some pocket holes and then attached everything using Kreg screws. A really good tip when building bases is to use super glue to hold your pieces in place before you screw them together. I like to use an activator with mine because it creates an instant bond when you put the 2 pieces together. Before attaching the base to the bottom, I did use my router to round over all of the edges. I drilled some pilot holes and then used a larger bit to create some countersink holes and then attached everything using wood screws. When making the countersink holes, I did put some painter's tape on my drill bit so that I wouldn't go too far down. I do have actual countersink drill bits for this, but I unfortunately misplaced them, so just know if you don't have those that a normal drill bit will work just as fine. Just make sure that it's slightly larger than the head of the screw that you're using. Now, what you may not know is I actually was working on my client's kitchen table alongside this server, so I had 3 completely different types of wood that I needed to match in color. I had the mahogany veneer, I had the oak base, and the pine top on the table. I wasn't going to be staining the top drawers, so I grabbed that along with some scrap pine and oak that I had laying around, and I did a few test swatches. I used the Refinish stains, and on my first swatch I did rich caramel, on the second I did walnut, and on the third I did a 50-50 mix of the two. I decided to go with walnut on the veneer and then use the mixture of the two on the oak and the pine. I ended up doing 3 coats of stain on the base, and I did 1 coat of stain on the veneer. Before I could stain the top, I had to take care of these gouges, and I did that by using a damp cloth and an iron to steam them out. If you've never done this before, basically what you're doing is using that steam to help raise that wood grain back up. I move my iron back and forth over the gouges and periodically check to see if they're raised. When they felt raised enough, I waited for the wood to dry, and then I sanded them flush with 180 grit sandpaper. This spot was a lot deeper than the others, so I ended up trying to steam it again to see if I could raise it a little bit more. It ended up not cooperating as well as the others, so I ended up having to take a pick and just pick out the rest of the paint. I sanded it a little bit more and just called it good. It wasn't perfect, but it did look a heck of a lot better than it did. Now let's just pretend that you saw me painting some primer, because I thought I was recording when I wasn't, but I ended up doing a coat of primer. I sanded it with 400 grit sandpaper, and I did 2 more coats after this because there was a lot of bleed through on this piece. I also decided last minute that I wanted this edge stain instead of painted, so I used a mixture of royal walnut and rich caramel to do that. Although my clients did give me creative freedom, I still had them pick out their own paint color, and they chose this amazing blue from Behr, and it's called Extreme. I absolutely love bold colors, but I don't get to do them often because unfortunately they just don't sell well in my area. But I got to use it on this piece, and I couldn't have been more excited. I did end up having to do 3 coats of this color, and in between each coat I also sanded with 400 grit sandpaper. I still had to color match the hardware holes that I filled, and I did that by using the furniture repair paste. I had to mute this clip because of the noise in the background, but here's a small little time lapse of me doing one of the doors. I also had some ghosting left behind from the trim that I took off of the doors, so to camouflage that a little bit better, I did make my own toner. I used water-based polyurethane and mixed in equal parts of the rich caramel and royal walnut stain. I applied 3 coats onto the doors, and I also ended up applying a couple of coats to the top as well as the doors and the base so that everything would blend together. The inside of these drawers were in excellent condition, so I didn't think it was necessary to line them. Instead, I just wiped them down with some Howard Feed-In wax to recondition the wood. And then the last thing I had to do was attach the new hardware and hinges that I had picked out. Now, before I show you what it looks like now, I wanted to remind you all of what it looked like before. And if you want to see more furniture transformations or the occasional DIY, then go ahead and subscribe to my channel. And here's what it looks like now. I absolutely love how this piece turned out, and so do my clients. I'm happy that I removed all of that trim because I really think this scallop detail comes through now, and I'm even more excited that there was some really awesome veneer underneath all of that paint. So like always, thank you for watching and spending some time with me. Let me know what you think in the comments. Even if you don't like it, just be respectful, and I'll talk to y'all soon.